A big shakeup happening in Washington, D.C. as Victoria Nuland announces her resignation. She had been serving during the Biden administration as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and will now be stepping down over the coming weeks in order to retire. The announcement was made by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who praised Nuland for 3.5 decades of public service, let's put that in giant air quotes, in which she has served under 6 presidents and 10 secretaries of state. I think the best attempt to understand this shock resignation comes from Daryl Cooper of my favorite podcast, Murder Made, a man with many years spent in military intelligence. He recaps the situation like this, quote, "Big news likely signaling a major policy shift. Nuland has run point on our Russia-Europe policy ever since we helped engineer the Maidan coup d'etat. The results, after 10 years, are in. Ukraine is destroyed and has permanently lost Crimea and its main industrial region. Europe is deindustrializing. Russia is permanently alienated and tighter than ever with China, India, and Iran. Much of the world refused to isolate Russia and suffered no consequences. Institutions central to U.S. dollar hegemony no longer viewed as neutral. Nordstrom broke the seal on sabotaging international infrastructure. Russian military capabilities significantly increased, not decreased. Countries like Iran, North Korea, etc. have seen that short of total war, NATO conventional capabilities are quite limited. Still, Nuland is one of those undead creatures in Washington who has only ever failed upward, so her resignation probably indicates her usefulness has finally run out," end quote. Joining us now to discuss is Dave DeCamp, the host of Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp and a news editor for antiwar.com. Dave, thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me, Kara. Good to be here.
Great. So what first comes to your mind when you hear that Nuland is out, aside from all the confetti and party balloons?
Yeah, well, I think Martyr Made, who I'm also a huge fan of his podcast as well. Everybody should listen to his history of Israel, Palestine, and early Zionism. It's just a great resource. But I think his analysis is probably correct that this might signal a shift in the Russia-Ukraine policy because Nuland's 62 years old, which might be retirement age for normal people. But for someone like Nuland, you know, these people who like to retain power for as long as they possibly can, it does seem a little early. And you know, you think of any single person that you could put all this whole Ukraine policy for the past 10 years on. Of course, this was a, overall, deep state neocon agenda for a long time. But Nuland was the face of it, especially in 2014 when she was showing up to the Maidan protests, handing out cookies. And then there's that infamous leaked phone call from right before Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president at the time, was thrown out. And it's Nuland speaking with Jeffrey Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, and they're discussing who should be in the next Ukrainian government. And speaking of Pyatt, I always forget he's actually in the Biden administration as well. He has some position as an energy envoy. So these people always manage to stick around. But I think it could signal a shift. And one thing I noticed was, so she was in her position in the State Department now, she's about the 3rd in charge. But for a few months, she was acting as the acting Deputy Secretary of State when the position was vacant. And I assumed that they would pick Nuland for the job, but they didn't. They picked Kurt Campbell, who was on the National Security Council. Now, Campbell is a notorious China hawk. Nuland is the Russia hawk. So I thought that was interesting. And that might show, even though the U.S. is so focused on this proxy war in Ukraine, the debacle in the Middle East supporting Israel slaughtering Palestinians, this new war in Yemen, they still say that they call China the big threat. So I think this might be an indication that, as you know, it's clear to everybody that Ukraine has no chance of winning this thing. So maybe getting the face of the, U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine out of the administration was something that they wanted to do.
That is interesting. And going back to what you were saying a moment ago with her actions leading up to what we saw with the invasion, the Russian invasion of 2022, but all the coups and everything else happening right on Russia's border, really provoking it to begin in the first place. I didn't realize that there were nicknames like the midwife of Maidan and the cookie monster. You said like giving out the cookies. I didn't realize that, but I'll keep that in the back of my mind now in the arsenal.